Greetings, this is Craig Pepin, Project Lead for the Davis Grant. Thank you for listening to this audio recording from the Spring 2024 Competency Fellows Workshop Series. These workshops are funded by a grant from the Davis Educational Foundation, and together with other materials funded by the grant and available on the Competencies website, are designed to help enhance your understanding and learning of Champlain's college competencies. Today's workshop, titled Deciphering Quantitative Literacy, is led by Melanie Brown, our Quantitative Literacy Fellow.
Great. Good morning and welcome to the latest in the Davis Grant Meet the Competencies workshops. My name is Melanie Brown and I'll be excited to talk to you this morning about deciphering quantitative literacy. And I've got some time at the end for questions, but since we're really kind of an intimate gathering of friends in real time right now, feel free to chime in with questions as they come to you here. All right, so this is my official abstract here. Join us as we unlock the mysteries of the quantitative literacy competency. There's so much more to this competency than just number crunching. This workshop is a general introduction to the criteria that comprise this competency. This includes clarifying what the quantitative literacy is and isn't, and a discussion of how this competency compares to the math requirement each Champlain student must complete. I submitted that abstract back in February. We'll more or less stick to this, but it was clear as I was putting this together that really making sure that we raise general awareness about what this competency is a really important first step for everybody. So hoping today that we can start answering a couple questions and then maybe have a discussion here. So really figuring out what is quantitative literacy, how is it different from just math, and then really getting to know what's in our quantitative literacy competency, and then be able to talk about maybe how this shows up in other classes. All right, so there are a lot of different definitions for quantitative literacy, just depending on who you talk to. I took this definition based on what we've described here at Champlain with our kind of holistic definition of quantitative literacy. So thinking about the ability to interpret quantitative information, apply appropriate mathematical methods to solve quantitative problems, and communicate solutions in an appropriate context here. And so here at Champlain, our competency actually has 5 components. So identifying the opportunity. So when is a quantitative approach going to be appropriate for answering a question? Then the actual applying and solving once you've identified a method. Communicating, so really being able to justify why you did what you did. Interpret quantitative information, and then discussing strengths and weaknesses of a quantitative approach in the human context. So kind of our guiding principle in the math department, at least on the trad side, is that math is everywhere. You just need to know where to look. However, I would argue for a lot of us, it's not necessarily where to look, but that first step is more how to look. How should we be thinking about our classes and what we're doing here? So I'm running a really fun research class this semester. It's part of a fellowship program that I'm in, and I've got 2 research teams working on problems with external partners. And one of my teams is actually working with Josh and Ellen, really digging into the college competency data as currently mapped. So looking at it at the course level, and then how courses then as they're fit together in programs, like what's our competency baseline right now, which I think is going to be really valuable work for both the Davis Grant as it's getting underway, as well as our own curricular evolution here. So this is a pure frequency chart. So the data that my students have access to right now, where it's most consistent, is with the original 9 competencies here. To a lesser extent, they've got a smaller subset of courses that have the DEI competency mapped. And then once we made the decision to split apart information and tech literacy, as well as scientific and quantitative literacy, some courses have been remapped at that more granular level. But what we really want to just be focusing in on is what you don't see my cursor. So the frequency chart. But if you're like me and frequencies in this way don't really do much for you, other than maybe you notice some subtle shading differences, this one might be a little bit more meaningful. So this is that same frequency data, but laid out in a histogram. And welcome, friends. We are living this quantitative literacy competency right now. We are interpreting some quantitative information here. So what you see on your screen is all of the competencies. The blue bar is how many courses are mapped at a 3. Red, how many courses are mapped at a 2. Green, how many are mapped at a 1. And that yellow color is how many are mapped at a 0. And you'll notice that there is one competency that is a distinct outlier here, and number of times that it is mapped at a 0. It is the joint scientific and quantitative literacy, but that speaks to the exact reason why we're having this conversation today. Is I think that 0 may actually just be people not really understanding what this competency is and just saying, well, I don't really do math in my class, therefore it's a 0 here. So we're going to see what we can start dispelling, deciphering. I'm teaching cryptography this semester, so everything is in terms of like ciphers. Yeah, that's what we want to focus in on. And I do want to make sure we see like this. These images are courtesy of Matt Crawford, who's on the team working on college competencies. And there are all sorts of really fun visuals. And anybody who sees this talk in a timely fashion is welcome to see their final presentation Tuesday, April 30th at 3:45, and email me and I can get you the rest of the information. All right, so an important piece in just figuring out quantitative literacy versus math is making sure we've got the lay of the land here. So currently, every Champlain student is required to take at least one math class for graduation. But we're in a situation where different majors have different math requirements. And I know CCO students, what I'm going to be referencing in the next slides really are focusing on the trad math classes. And I apologize, that was an oversight on my part here to not include the CCO requirements, but I know that those are going to look a little bit different. But I think the idea about what I'm going to say is the same, whether it's trad or CCO. So for a trad student population, like I said, different majors have different requirements. So we have an overwhelming number of our students taking Intro to Stats. That is our largest service course with generally 7 to 9 sections per semester here. So we're thinking all of the Stiller majors, most of the SOC majors, and then data analytics, digital forensics, cybersecurity, game design. We've got another group of students who take at least Calc 1, but really everybody in this list takes more math beyond Calc 1. So we're thinking about applied math, computer science and innovation, game programming, and then also sometimes game design. And that's because game design students have a choice of whether they want to do Intro to Stats or Calc, and that's usually determined by whether or not they want to add a game programming minor. Would influence their math course. But then we've got this whole other group of students. They get math choice. It's where if you see math XXX show up in any kind of catalog, that is just a placeholder for take a math class. We're not going to specify. And that is most of our CCM majors, as well as social work fall in that category. And a lot of those math choice students take our Math 115 class, which is math for problem solving and decision making. And it's a nice catch-all of not necessarily a lot of new math content, but a chance to use what you picked up in high school and just in life to see how it actually shows up in your day-to-day life. The motivating question for that class is, what are kind of the math skills and ideas that students are going to need 10 years after college graduation? That's a lot of financial math and enough stats to be a reasonable citizen and consumer. So when we kind of compare the two, here's another chance to interpret some kind of quantitative information, recognize Venn diagram here with our three kind of categories of at least the trad math requirements against the language in our quantitative literacy criteria or competency. We're in a position where when we were designing the quant-lit competency, we were trying to keep all of the language broad enough that regardless of the math course that a student was taking, on the trad side at least, that they were getting at least most of the way there. And that's really, I think, the big takeaway of everything that we're talking about today is that the math class gives you a really good foundation, but it should not be like the sole place where a student gets a chance to demonstrate their competency. Because all the pieces are there, but they're there at differing levels for differing courses. And that's just the way it goes here. And so that one required math course does not quite get students to proficiency, but it should give every major, every program a solid foundation for enhancing quant lit in ways that make sense for the program. And I'm actually really proud that there's that flexibility built in, and that different students are taking different math classes for different majors because they're just different math needs. Math is super duper broad, and I'm glad it's not a one size fits all here. So it's not where to look, but first step, how should we be looking in our curriculum here? So again, we've got our 5 different criteria as part of this competency. And I wanted to just take a couple minutes and walk through each one and not necessarily run you through the rubric in great full detail, but just to give you a sense of really what's in this competency. And then would love to then start having a discussion about what this could look like in different courses here. So yeah, we're looking at identify opportunity, apply and solve, communicate, interpret, and then strengths and weaknesses in a human context here. All right, so identify opportunity. So that really is having students be able to look at a situation and think, wow, I should use some kind of quantitative approach, some kind of math tool or idea to answer this question, solve this problem, but also be able to recognize what's an appropriate method. You know, if you're asking a question like, what's the mean of this data set? You're not going to want to have somebody do a first derivative. Like, that just doesn't make sense. And so thinking what does make sense here? So examples of not evident would be if somebody is told, hey, this is this type of problem, the student just does not know where to go with that information. Emerging would be when someone is told the problem type, they can pick kind of the expected answer. Developing is more, here's the problem. I'm not going to tell you what type, but you should be able to see that problem and know where you should go with, an expected method. And then proficient is, adding that extra piece on. Given a problem, they know that they need a quantitative approach. They can select an appropriate method, and note that it's an, not the. There are multiple appropriate methods depending on the situation. But then they can also kind of explain why they chose what they did for that method. Apply and solve. This is actually the kind of the number crunching piece of this. And so, not evident would be just the wrong formula entirely, because you can know the right method, but then not look up the right formula for it. Like, you could say, well, I need the area of a circle, but if you're not using the circle area formula, then that's done you no good here. Emerging would be, you've got the right formula, but you're not using the right numbers to evaluate. Developing, you've got the right formula, the right numbers, but maybe there's some numeracy issues that you're still addressing. So you've messed up a computation, either doing it by hand or maybe how you were inputting it into some kind of software or tool here. Whereas proficient, we're thinking right formula, right numbers, right answer. Okay, communicate. That's where someone can actually explain the steps in their computational process when prompted. This is absolutely that show your work piece. And I didn't get into the continuum for the competency, but really thinking like, here's somebody who showed all of their work versus just some of their work. And really, can you gauge where somebody's thought process is or how they were thinking about solving that problem? Now, interpret, this is the one that can actually be completely independent from actual problem solving. And this is, I think, a really important piece to take away, because I know that in all sorts of different courses, students are asked to deal with quantitative information, but the faculty members may think, well, they're not solving equations, therefore that we're not dealing with quantitative literacy, and that's false. That's false. Anytime you have your students, you give them something that has a graph and they have to explain what their graph is, that's quantitative literacy. Anything that has any kind of numbers in it where they're having to interpret what those numbers mean in context, that is demonstrating quantitative literacy. Anytime you just put a little, one of those silly USA Today infographics just to point out like how silly it is, most likely that's going to have some quantitative literacy attached to it. Now, you absolutely can have this interpret step as kind of that final piece of actual problem solving. Like, okay, you've gotten a solution. What does that actually mean in context? But it doesn't have to be as part of that kind of problem solving process. They can be an independent piece. And then the last bit here, the strengths and weaknesses in human context. This is probably the one aspect of the quantitative literacy competency where that one math class is probably not addressing it to the level that we would expect a college graduate to have. And that's because our math courses really are very much skills-based. So giving students the opportunity to figure out, okay, when do I want to use each method, applying and solving with that method, explaining why they did what they did, interpreting what their answer means in context. But then the strengths and weaknesses in human context, these are going to happen in varying shades depending on the course here. Because I think students who take statistics and then math for problem solving and decision making are going to have the most opportunities to talk about the strengths and weaknesses in the human context. It just does not come up as much in the calc-based coursework. And that's because the calc-based coursework is pretty crammed with skills and that prerequisite knowledge that those students need to move on to the next level. So what are we talking about with strengths and weaknesses? We're talking about students being able to understand both the power of quantitative reasoning when addressing complex issues, as well as the limitations, ethical implications, and potential biases when applying quantitative reasoning in broader contexts, as well as an appreciation for how quantitative reasoning works together with other modes of thought to enhance human understanding. And it's actually the research class that I was telling you about, the ones who made the cool infographics on the competencies. They are now, I think for a lot of them, it's one of the first times where they are having to wrestle with, are there biases in their data? Like they're coming up with these solutions, but the fact that there's not this like one ideal solution, and that it is a solution that sits within this human context, and that the information that they were working with is potentially biased. The way that they were then handling that information could be potentially biased, and actually thinking deeply on the ethics and how far they can go. Like my competencies group, they can't talk about all 12 competencies right now because we've got limitations right now in the data. So they wouldn't be able to make meaningful inferences on anything when we teased apart the literacies, for example. And it's interesting that, these are students who've taken a lot of advanced math classes and are now in like junior and senior year. And this is the first time that, at least in a math class, they're addressing this. But I know that in, like I said, problem solving and decision making, as well as intro to stats, this is a bigger part of those courses. But I would hope that this shows up in other courses as well. And so with that, I wanted to open up some conversation here because I
Wow,
can
I mean, that was really good, and very clear. I think you're looking at that chart you had at the beginning of the frequency, right? I think one of the things you're highlighting is with stuff like quantitative literacy, with stuff like communication, and some of the other ones, where it involves a spectrum of things from the very detailed, very complex, sort of to the more ordinary, in some ways. People are caught when they're trying to code these things in terms of like their classes and where they map them to the competencies between, oh, I'm being really narrow because you're not doing the specific thing. And then otherwise, or like every class you have has a one or two because, as you say, so many different aspects of these competencies come into play. So to some extent, I think the mapping are always going to be synthetic. They're going to be sort of arbitrary. And if one of the things about this conversation about the competencies we're having might be a good way to standardize sort of some of our thinking about at what point do we indicate or map a competency in our classes. Is there some sort of consensus on, you know, does everybody get a one pretty much for almost many of these competencies simply because they're there, or do we finesse that a bit and have some other criteria? I don't have the answers, but I think that's a great conversation to have.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the same conversation that my research team has been having as they're like, so what is the difference between a one and a two? I mean, or a zero. And the number of times I've been like, do you think people just put this as a zero or left it blank in the curriculum form because they were just too lazy to think about it? And I was like, we can't put a value judgment right now. There's a limitation on how far our work can go, but we can certainly establish data and trends and then let that prompt further questions. Hi, Janet.
Hi. So, yeah, the question that Robert asked of like, well, that's what I came here to find out. I want to know how to legitimately be able to map twos. I don't know about threes in, say, our humanities courses, but I know in some of the proposals I've been working on recently in courses developing, the intent is to incorporate more quantitative literacy. But as Robert said, how do I integrate quantitative literacy to the point where it's more than a one? And I don't want to blanketly just go one just because they look at a graph, but maybe it is there. But it has to do with the assessment. I mean, are we assessing it? Are we directly assessing it? Is it not being assessed, but it's there? Those are the differences between ones and threes. And I think threes are precious. It's like, using the IDEA. Not everything can be, what is the biggest, you know what I'm saying? Everything is kind of in the middle except the exceptionals. So yeah, how do we get to twos in courses that are other than math? I mean, we've got a lot of tech courses in CCO, so it's going to show up there, but I'd be curious to see this. Is it a histogram?
It is a histogram.
Your data with the CCO competencies mapped. And again, I think it comes back to education, like Robert alluded to, education for us, like so that we're intentionally mapping to those competencies and not like, well, I think it's there. Let's give it a 3. Or I'd like for it to be there. Hope for it to be there. I wish it was there. But yeah, I'd like to drill into that.
I think Janet hit it on the nail on the head with assessment is really one of the key things. And one of the challenges there is sort of the unexamined biases that we have when we're doing assessment. Oftentimes I find, you assign something to students and I have a particular thing in my mind about what I expect to see back on part of the assignment. What I don't always do is drill down and think that how much of that is really based upon some of these other competencies that I'm not thinking of. Like if I give them an article to look at that it has quantitative information in it, graphs, charts, whatever, and I have a particular expectation perhaps about what the product that they're going to turn in looks like. Am I actually thinking about to what degree does their successful completion of the assignment depended upon the quantitative literacy of analyzing, interpreting that data. And if I don't, break that out, then I might think that, well, this has nothing much to do with this. This is something totally different. But in reality, I am assessing that without telling them or myself their quantitative literacy, and other literacies, obviously, it applies to.
I know, absolutely. And I think this is actually really exciting that we're digging deeper into like what these are, to then be thinking about how, like, what does assessment look like? How are we thinking about, like, I love that, Janet, like the two, like what is the two? Because it's not quite a three, because threes are pretty special. It's more than one.
I was just trying to look it up. I know when we were coming up with some molecular biology like rankings, there is like verbiage that goes along.
There's a definition.
Right.
And it's a little thing, but it does give you a direction.
There's a couple versions of it.
Okay.
It's probably making this up. But in a three, we're expecting to be both assessed and taught, right?
Right. Yeah.
And also, we should be able to map it to a course learning outcome. Because even though when we map courses to college competencies, we don't map each individual course learning outcome to the competencies. But if you can't, right, if you're like, well, we always do a team project in that class, but it's not in the course learning outcomes, you hire an adjunct to teach it. They don't realize that's a centerpiece.
No.
You can't map it as a
Collaboration is in second place with number of zeros.
Right. So what I think is interesting is, one, you took a quantitative approach to talking about this and giving us a picture
Of course I did.
how it is. Right, exactly. And also we're exploring the limits of the quantitative in terms of the threes, twos, and ones and our classification system. And I think it's interesting because what I end up teaching a lot of is logical reasoning. And so I wonder how much of that overlaps with mathematical reasoning.
I think it's a pretty heavy overlap. And in one of the original, okay, so we kind of redid this work in 2015, 16, maybe 17. And the quantitative literacy competency originally had like specifically like a numeracy, like number sense laid out. When we revised that, we ended up tucking that more into apply and solve, really to make it a little more general, because a lot of logical reasoning, it falls in this realm. And actually thank you for bringing that one up, Josh, because a lot of the students, if you're not a game designer in the Calc 1 category here, you're taking Calc 1 and you're also taking discrete math. And so when we think about students, when they get to Champlain, we have an increasing number of students who come in with AP Calc credit. And so like when we think, well, what is the Champlain contribution to your college competencies? For a lot of those students, it's what's happening in their discrete math class, which is less kind of computationally driven and more logic and proof, which still hits at the same pieces, but it's less kind of computationally driven and more of that logical reasoning.
And I do think like computer programming or doing 3D programming extensively, right? You have a lot of quantitative reasoning baked into it. You're just language and tools are different to think about it. But so it may be that one, our faculty aren't always good at recognizing when it's present. The other thing I think it's an interesting broad view on the quantitative literacy. I've run into a lot of students who have like this math trauma in high school where they are very resistant to it. And yet they're fine at math if they don't let the emotions get in the way of it. And I think that's a bit of our role, is kind of getting them out of that.
We've been building in more trauma-informed pedagogy in math for precisely that reason.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that in my classes where students like, oh, I just can't do that. Like, and they just totally, I'm like, what? No, you are going to do this together. We're going to do it. I had a question. What year did the separation happen of the competencies? Is that before our time?
No.
It's only about 5 years.
Right. Because I remember pushing really hard. It was right. So I got here. Yeah, like it was rather recent because I remember it was within my first year, and I got here in 2013 that there was like new talk about competencies, and one of my bravest acts as a new faculty member was raising my hand and saying, like, it is really dumb that we are lumping scientific literacy with quantitative literacy. Why are we doing that?
And it's interesting to see the style of scientific literacy versus the quantitative. The scientific literacy has a lot more understanding science in the context of the larger world, and particularly the human world, and not necessarily being a great scientist. It's not that literacy. Whereas the quantitative literacy does have the real world, but you also have to be decently good at doing the math. Pay attention, which is an interesting style.
I think part of that is probably because there are so many different types of science, and many of them are extremely specific. Whereas while there are different types of math and mathematicians, obviously, it's a bit easier to generalize at least at the arithmetic and discrete sort of levels for people. That's probably why they have. But you're right; it is stylistically.
Well, I don't know. I guess I would disagree because I was on that rubric group for science, and I don't think that you could certainly be developing, I guess, but in order to be proficient, you have to be able to kind of similarly explain why you used a particular method and be able to justify it. And then science is just one of these bullet points. It's not embedded in all of them.
Yeah, we don't make people necessarily do lab science as part of the science competency. I think that's kind of what Josh is pointing out in some ways. But yeah, I mean,
No, we do. They have to take a lab-based science to be able to get there.
To a degree, but you can satisfy the scientific competency without doing that, I think, pretty clearly.
Being able to do original science is not baked into the description. So it's captured in the criteria, but it's not like if you read the description, it is as much about the human experience in society, not descriptive, which stood out to me because I just read it again this past week.
Okay.
It's just a different emphasis, which I actually think kind of hits. It's how people tend to interact with science is they need to be able to read about it and know that does this apply? Is it being used wrong? Do I trust this evidence? Right? It's almost got a little bit of that info-lit style to it versus the quantitative, where you actually are doing that. You're finding the approach.
I was thinking of the analysis, like on that histogram, is ANL that's analysis?
Yes.
It'd be interesting to see, because there's a lot of threes in that category. It'd be interesting to see what courses make up that.
Well, I'm glad you asked. April 30th, 345, Joyce 205. They've done all sorts of analysis here on do certain competencies show up together mapped the same way in courses, and does that tell us anything? Looking at the structures within each major of how competencies show up. Before we do that, I just want to go back real fast to my best guess of where we're seeing the difference between maybe the scientific literacy and quantitative literacy here. And that's when I go back to the 10 years graduated. You're probably not going to be running your own experiments on water quality at your house, but you probably are going to have to do computations and stuff on your own. Right. And so there's a different kind of practitioner element in your day-to-day life that is a little bit different. But I would expect probably that lab science requirement is setting that foundation upon which the rest of that scientific literacy is is built.
Can I ask you a question about the students' experience of like work? This is a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but like were the students in your group, your Math 400 that are working on this, were they aware of the college competencies?
One of them was, and the others were not.
And I'm curious, like beyond just the exercise of doing this, like, do they feel like it's a meaningful part of their education to fulfill these competencies, or do they feel like,
Oh, so they feel like the class that they're in right now is a meaningful part of their education.
yeah?
Um,
But I'm just wondering how the competencies resonate for them as students.
that's actually something that we haven't talked about too much recently. Like at first when they were getting involved in the work, they're like, I had no idea this is all in here. Like, and they're like, once they started playing in Curriculog, they know all the advanced search features now in Curriculog. They're like, whoa, we had no idea. And just like not even the competencies, but like a course learning outcome
the
versus
level
a
of detail,
program
yeah.
learning outcome. I don't know. They will be really curious to see what the changes to the idea survey is gonna look like, because they didn't really feel like they were aware or knew that this was a goal of their education.
I think the new survey will be a check on understanding of this mapping, because we're asking students to say, was this college competency a component of the course, right? And so
I think it's an interesting question because they're going to be like, huh? What is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like it's really interesting work, and part of the challenge that the students on this team are having is figuring out like how do you actually baseline metric for feeling like somebody's met all of the competencies. Is that kind of cumulative exposure to each competency?
The number.
Right. Yeah. Or is it like, math, like is it, you got that one deep dive in your math class and then like that's good except for occasional like one-offs.
And then just in terms of like the Gen Ed group and the work that they're doing in the steering committee, I can't remember that they're like bundling them all. And what is it science and math, or what is bundled together?
I don't know. I'm not on that group either. I know that Warren, who is on that group, has asked this team to take a look at certain pairs of competencies. Bob.
No, I think what Rob is talking about is really important, because as this discussion about competencies, when we talk about Gen Ed revision, clearly understanding what we want from students in terms of their level of familiarity, proficiency in things like math and science requires us to really, I think, dig into these competencies and have input into the criteria, so that we are ensuring that our graduates are able to do the things we want them to do. Often with stuff like this, because a lot of people, are kind of scared sometimes by math and science. It doesn't get the same sort of engagement from a lot of folks as it needs to. It's really important stuff when we're building a broader educational sort of portfolio. So I think the work we're doing in the competencies here can really help inform that process by identifying and clarifying the language about what is really important, what do we really want, and that will help drive what kind of classes do we need to get there. So, because can't do that in a vacuum.
Right, but I think that is a deeper philosophical question of like, do we want with these competencies a lot of frequent exposure in multiple courses, or is it okay if there's kind of a almost check the box approach?
Can you speak, Melanie, about how you address like that fear in your classroom? Like you said, trauma-informed pedagogy. Like, what does that mean exactly in practice?
So I'm not gonna profess to be kind of an expert
Yeah.
in it, but we do a lot of helping, build in a lot of flexibility and just like upfront, like we've all had bad experiences in math, like us included. And we're just going to be really, really aware of that and like make sure that there are a lot of flexibility, sometimes opportunities for like rewrites. Like it's okay if you don't get it right the first time. One of our adjuncts is also a math interventionist in one of the local school districts and works a lot with Title I population. And she's brought in a whole bunch of her practices and like learning a lot more from her. Because yeah, like it's not that somebody is bad at math, but they've had a bad experience with a teacher who convinced that student that they were not going to be good at math and could not be good at math. I know we have a lot of colleagues who I'm sure are walking around with their own math trauma. And I suspect that's a driver in what we're seeing with the way the competencies are mapped here.
I also think that the game is changing again. So like your ability to do elementary school math doesn't matter because you're going to have a calculator, but you're doing the concepts, right? It's the same in data analysis. The tools are now getting so good. You need to be able to explain in precise words what you want, but the tools can get you there. And so I think people's resistance to math is actually holding them back because they can approach it in ways that won't be as scary to them because the way they're taught is like everything from scratch with the numbers, which is great because you understand the underlying theory fully, but they can still get at some of it without that.
Right. And actually our lower level math classes are going more kind of tool based, like intro to stats. Very rarely is a student going to be like hand crunching anything. Right. Like maybe like, can you use this formula to compute a test statistic? But more of making sure that if you're having a tool do something, you're giving it the correct instructions and that you are able to right. So the apply and solve piece looks a little bit different because there's a heavier emphasis on the like identifying the method you need and then being able to interpret the results and see like, does this actually make sense based on what I gave you here? Janet.
Yeah, a lot of things go through my head. I think culturally or societally, there's this unspoken dismissiveness of math skill and acceptance of math phobia that we wouldn't do with reading. I mean, it's become, or has always been okay, I think, to say, oh, I'm terrible at math or I don't do math. We'd never say that about reading. So I'm thinking that we're pushing that rock a little bit too. And sometimes maybe it's about doing math without acknowledging you're doing math. Like, oh, by the way, you just did math. Oh, and I mean, I did it myself. When I spoke to the histogram, I was kind of quiet, and rather than say, is that a histogram? It was, and I just recognized that in myself, So I think it's such a cultural or societal habit to downplay our math or numeracy abilities and the importance of it.
Yes, like I am just so pleasantly surprised at how many of y'all showed up for this morning, because like every time I walk into a room, what do? I'm a math professor. Oh, I'm so bad at math.
Exactly.
Yeah. Whereas, yeah, nobody is going to be like, ugh, I am functionally illiterate.
Right. I know. That's what I'm talking about.
And I am proud of that fact. And will tell you, no.
Don't even show me a book. Like, don't even ask me to read that paragraph. And not to make a joke of any of that, but that's my point.
Yeah.
So thank you for
You're
that.
welcome. And I love that point about like doing this without even recognizing that we do it. Like we threw up this histogram on the slide, and I'm sure all of us looked at it and like immediately started drawing meaning from it, but we didn't maybe even think, like, recognize that's what we were doing. Like, wow, we are living the quantlit competency right now.
And I wonder how much of the limitations of the science of quantitative literacy is because we dedicated a single course in every program to it, and we let everyone else off the hook about thinking about it.
I think that's probably a big driver, but I also think the murkiness of like the 1, the 2, the 3. Like I've had several really good conversations with colleagues in CCM who were really instrumental when we rebuilt our Math 115 course. And they're like, yeah, like I know my students are doing, like there's all sorts of math sitting behind like visual art. But like, am I assessing their ability to do math while they're, doing graphic design work or something? And so I think the kind of ambiguity of what counts as that assessment piece, I think maybe also a factor.
Well, I already said that, but just like maybe their own fear of being able to assess that. That was, yeah.
Multifaceted for sure. But I think this is a really important first step, is just like, what is this all about? And how does it relate to the one math class? Or how does Silet relate to the one?
It's so
science
great
class?
for students to be part of the conversation. I think that's been a missing piece.
Absolutely. Bob, I see you put some things in the chat that may not come across in the recording. Is there anything that you wanted to elevate?
No, just some comments about analysis that were made back then, because that was my competency that I was doing the stuff on. Just illustrating again, one of the reasons why I think we have everybody doing threes or more people doing threes in analysis is because everybody is just sorts of assuming that they do analysis, when in reality, I think those threes need to be a lot lower because they're probably not really assessing or interrogating the steps in the process in the way we want them to do. But again, it's part of the problem we talked about, which when people are familiar with something and think they know what it means and what they're doing, they tend to just sort of assume that they're doing it and don't always investigate it. And the flip side of things they're not familiar with that they may be doing, but they're not capturing that either. So it's about awareness.
Yeah. For what it's worth, communication has the slight edge. They have 203.
Everybody talks, we must be communicating.
Where
so.
Analysis is only 201 here. Yeah. Other questions, comments right now? We're just about at time.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for showing up. Thank you everybody watching this wherever it gets recorded and stored here. And know that I'm always happy to talk about how quantitative literacy may show up in your courses, or just more about this competency or math or just anything. Let me know.
Thank you.
Again, students presenting on this Tuesday, April 30th, 3:45. That'll be for their final presentation, but I may ask them to give it that presentation again for a broader faculty audience. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Melanie. This was very helpful.
Thank you.